So as we head into the end of the semester, we're taking a very small peek at a couple of extra topics, starting with international trade. And we're just getting an introductory look at it. International trade is a very complex and involved subject, very interesting, but there are entire classes devoted to international trade, even at the undergraduate level. So if you want to know more about international trade, after you take your intermediate macro and micro courses, which give a little more information than I'm going to give, have at it. I would absolutely encourage you to take a full class on it if you want to get to know more. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. But we're really just going over kind of the first day's worth of stuff. We don't go too in depth in a principles class. Basically, we're just going to look at the simplistic picture that helps us arrive at the answer to the question of why on earth would countries trade with each other at all. We hear things like buy American, only buy American, jobs get shipped overseas, and all sorts of things that make international trade seem bad. And self-sufficiency is thought of as a good thing. And in many cases it is. We went over this at the beginning of the semester, and in fact it's a little related. The idea that being self-sufficient is all well and good, but we get a lot more done if we all work together and trade with each other. If people stick to what they're best at doing and then trade with other people who are better at other things that they need produced, we produce a lot more. Goes back to Adam Smith and the pin makers. Specialization and then trade is where we get a lot of benefit. And if that works in a small town with a lot of different people who have different temperaments and backgrounds and skills, working together to make more than any one person can make by themselves, well, why wouldn't it work across an entire state with a lot of different cities working together? And if that works, why wouldn't it work for an entire nation? So far, nobody complains about an entire nation full of people all working together to make a whole bunch of different things and then trading within that nation. But if it's okay at that level, why stop there? Why not go international and have every country trade with every country? As people focus on what they're best at and focus on what their geography perhaps sets them up to be better at. That's maybe one of the most obvious examples of why international trade can be a good thing. Think of countries in very cold climates where northern European countries aren't going to be able to grow a whole lot of stuff that require really warm tropical climates to grow in, but should they have to do without because they can't grow it themselves? So there are a lot of ways in which we can already see that international trade is something that we should have, and pretty much everyone agrees with that, even if it seems like they don't sometimes when they get into some of the nuances of how trade arrangements should be done, and that goes beyond the scope of what we cover here. It's not as far beyond the scope of full classes on international economics, so it's worth studying. But here we're just looking beyond the question of whether you should trade, whether cold climates should trade with tropical climates. That's obvious. But what about cold climates trading with cold climates? When both countries who are trading with each other are perfectly capable of making whatever goods or services are being shipped across their borders. Why on earth do that? Well, that has to do with what we get at here, which is basically the difference between absolute and comparative advantage, and how specializing according to comparative advantage leads to gains for both countries in general. There are winners and losers in everything in economics, here in international trade too. There are domestic producers who might lose if comparative advantage from overseas is leveraged. But consumers domestically, if more of them are more likely to win by more than producers who are harmed, then society is better off going ahead and allowing for trade and more imports. So we're going to see how all of that works in the most simple manner. Now, that still doesn't mean that we shouldn't have things like tariffs and quotas and whatever else, because sometimes the producers are small businesses, and sometimes the producers have employees who would end up losing their jobs, who are low-income, vulnerable people, and we want to be considerate of that. The story I'm going to be telling here is the story that a lot of economists will point to essentially say that you let those low-income workers get laid off, and then you make sure you have safety nets for them. And there are plenty of economists who will argue about how in some cases you don't necessarily want to let that happen. But those are, again, robust arguments that go beyond here. But this does inform that basic scenario that they're all aware of and don't really disagree with when they get into some of those nuances. So, some of the benefits of trading with other countries. When we get into what I mean by comparative advantage, you'll see how there are, as a result, lower cost alternatives. Increased diversity of choices has to do with the fact that this is kind of the cold climate versus tropical climate kind of thing. It's one of the more obvious benefits of trade with other countries. Same thing, along those same lines, access to resources you might not otherwise have access to. So, I mentioned comparative advantage. It's important not to confuse it with absolute advantage. So this is when one country can just make more of something than another country. Absolute advantage is everywhere in international economics. You can have, and you may see a lot of examples as you proceed with your studies of economics of countries that have the absolute advantage in all goods and services that are being considered. Even in those cases, it can be beneficial for the country at the absolute advantage to trade with the country that does not have the absolute advantage in anything because of comparative advantage. While absolute advantage is about the overall capacity to produce the good or service. You put all your resources into producing that one good or service, and so does the other country. The country that makes more has absolute advantage. Even in those cases, remember this word opportunity costs. Opportunity costs, recall, when you don't have money available. Sometimes money can be an opportunity cost, but it's a way of helping us understand that money is it's a medium of exchange. And at the end of the day, there's something else that was produced. So if you're making more of one thing, there's that much less of another thing that you can make. And we can measure things in that way in terms of opportunity costs. The more of one good or service you make, the less of another good or service you have available to you. So even if you have the absolute advantage in producing one good or service, you may still have a comparative disadvantage because though you have greater capacity to produce that good or service, you have to give up more of another good or service. And another country may not have to give up as much of that other good or service. And that's where we can have gains from trade, even where one country has absolute advantage. So, to see how comparative advantage, where it would come from, there are a lot of reasons. Something that's also not here, populations will sometimes have different education levels. There can be long-standing traditions in some places where skills are just passed down from generation to generation, and so a country or a town or a village or whatever may just be that much better at producing a particular good or service, and so they should be specializing. There are a lot of places from which comparative advantage can be found. These differences in technology and so on are just some of them. But it's all about opportunity cost, and to understand how to figure out who should trade what with whom, you basically look to see what everybody's opportunity cost is, and then you compare. So, an advantage here, we're going to compare apples to oranges made by Australia and Canada. Two very different countries who are very far apart from each other, very different in a lot of respects. I don't know what the climactic realities are for each place being able to grow apples and oranges, but that doesn't really matter here. For whatever reason, these are the advantages that these two countries in this theoretical example have over each other. Again, this is not necessarily anything real. We're just being very simple with recognizable country names. Now, notice, Canada has the absolute advantage in everything. This is absolute advantage in action. These numbers define the maximum quantities of apples and oranges that these two countries can produce. If Australia made 0 oranges and only made apples, they would have 50 apples. If Australia didn't make any apples at all and only made oranges, they'd have 150 oranges. If they made some oranges but fewer than 150, they would have some apples, but it would be fewer than 50. So you can have a lot of stuff in between here, and you can know exactly what those are just based on these numbers, which we'll see in a second if you haven't already figured it out. Hint, it's ratios. So notice Canada, they can make 200 apples and 0 oranges, or they can make 200 oranges and 0 apples. Basically, these are the endpoints for the production possibilities frontiers, which we're going to look at if you remember those. And for simplicity, we're just going to look at linear PPFs with these as the endpoints for each country's frontier. So Canada can make 200 apples if they don't make any oranges. Australia can only make 50. Canada can make 200 oranges if they don't make a single apple. Australia can only make 150. Canada has the absolute advantage in everything. So why should Canada bother with Australia? Australia has nothing for them. Everything Australia can make, Canada can make more. Are there gains from trade here? I already basically said yes, but we're going to see from this example exactly how that works. So, opportunity cost. How much does an apple cost? The numbers are right here, but let's go back. In Australia, how much does an apple cost? Well, let's start with 50 apples. 50 apples will cost 150 oranges. 150 apples per 150 oranges. You solve the math, you find that you're losing 3 oranges for every 1 apple you make. In Canada, 1 orange for 1 apple. That's how you get these numbers. It says opportunity cost here, but you can absolutely say that an apple costs 3 oranges in Australia. In Canada, an apple only costs 1 orange. So we have different opportunity costs. How about the cost of an orange? Well, now you're just basically flipping those ratios on their head, which gives you a 1 for Canada's case, but for Australia, you have a third of an apple. An orange only costs a third of an apple. So now we can start to get a hint of why Canada might want to trade. Because over here, apples are much cheaper in Canada than they are in Australia. They cost 3 full oranges in Australia, but only 1 orange in Canada. But oranges are much cheaper in Australia than they are in Canada. It only costs a third of an apple to get 1 orange in Australia. Actually, for the same reason as why apples are more expensive. So this makes it clear that while Canada has an absolute and comparative advantage in making apples, they only cost 1 orange, Australia doesn't have the absolute advantage in making apples. Again, Australia is way, way behind Canada when it comes to making apples. You might have guessed that this is where they have their comparative advantage. But no, comparative advantage has nothing to do with the other. It has to do with your opportunity cost. So Australia has the comparative advantage in making apples. And we're going to see as we proceed with this example in the next couple videos that we absolutely are going to want Australia to specialize at least somewhat in making apples. They should make more apples and fewer oranges, if not specializing all the way. And we're going to look at both examples.